so I just want to share a little bit about him. Lord Monckton is visiting California from England, and he participated yesterday in a hearing at the Capitol on the issue of climate change and how California's carbon trading system compares with others around the world. Now, what's interesting about this is that we sent out an invitation to all 120 members of the California State Legislature, and only one person from the other side showed up. They were very eager to get into a discussion and very eager to participate in a debate, is what they called it, on the cap and trade or carbon trade system and AB 32 until we submitted the resume of the individual that was on our side. And then they respectfully declined to participate, some of them saying that they did not want to lend their name to give him credibility. That was one of the statements that was made. However, when I spoke to that individual, I said, "Oh, really?" I said, "Have you ever testified before Congress?" And she said, "No, ma'am." And I said, "Have you ever testified for a Chinese government or a foreign nation?" And she said, "No." And I said, "Well, he has several times. Have you ever advised foreign leaders?" And she said, "No, ma'am." And I said, "Okay, well, he has. So, we'd love for you to participate." And she still declined. Mary Nichols at CARB declined, her chief scientist declined. And so even though we did try to engage in a very lively discussion, we did have a packed hearing room. All the chairs were full. There was at least 100 people standing the entire time during the presentation. So it was very, very engaging. So I want to tell you that the climate change issue is back on the full discussion, and people are picking up the blogs and picking up articles. So we are hopefully, with the information that you hear tonight, which I believe to tell you is the truth about climate change from a leading expert that is all the way here from across the pond. So let me tell you a little bit about him. He's addressed large audiences in Sacramento at Sacramento State University yesterday evening, giving a fantastic and lively lecture on man's role in affecting the climate. Lord Monckton is a businessman, a newspaper editor, Cambridge-trained classical architect, and public orator. He, Sudoku, correct? He's also the founder of Sudoku, for all of you that play that game. That's pretty interesting. He just did that in his spare time. He's the former special advisor to British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and is one of the world's most famous speakers on man-caused climate history, the man-caused climate change theory. He is the former special advisor to British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, which I said. He has also organized and led various international climate conferences, having discussed the subject with the President of the Czech Republic, having twice spoken before representatives of the Chinese government, and has testified 4 times before the United States Congress. Most recently, Lord Monckton delivered the opening keynote address and speech for the first climate conference to be held at the official level in Colombia, and he also gave talks in the United Kingdom, Ireland, and Sicily. He also gave a lecture on climate economics at the Prague School of Economics in the United Nations Climate Conference in Durban, South Africa. Please give me a warm welcome for Lord Monckton.
Thank you very much.
That's going to knock your socks off. It's going to expose the truth and the lies that have been told to all of us. He's going to relate it to economics, and then we will finish in about 40 to 45 minutes, and we will take questions from the audience. Thank you.
My lords, that's me. Ladies and gentlemen, after that very flattering but largely mendacious introduction, I just can't wait to hear what I'm going to say. Now, just to test the sound levels, if there's anybody in the room who can't hear what I'm saying, would they please put their hand up? Well done, you're with me so far. Try to keep up, those of you at the back. Now, at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they don't do simple. So they wouldn't call a spade a spade. They would call it a one-person operated, manually controlled, foot-powered implement of simple and robust, yet adequately efficacious lignometallic composition, designated primarily, though by no means exclusively, for utilization on the part of hourly paid operatives deployed in the agricultural, horticultural, or constructional trades or industries, as the case may be, for purposes of carrying out such excavational tasks or duties as may from time to time be designated by supervisory grades as being necessary, desirable, expedient, apposite or germane, with regard to the ongoing furtherance of the task or objective in hand, or on the other hand, under foot Secretary General. Now, you will be pleased to know that I'm not going to talk like that tonight. I'm going to talk in plain English, which is all too seldom spoken in this debate. Let me begin by asking how many of you believe, even for an instant, that global warming caused by us is or may yet be dangerous? I see no hands, so that's the end of my speech. Good night. Can we start on the slides then? What I'm going to begin with is that part of the science which is not settled. We all agree that if you put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, you're going to get some warming. Get used to it. Established by experiment 150 years ago, just down the road from the club, don't you know, in London. That's when it was done. But the unsettled science is about how much warming we're going to get. And as you can see, there's a huge discrepancy between the 1 Celsius, or approximately 2 Fahrenheit, per century, which is the rate at which global warming has been happening since 1950. That's the green line there. And the very nearly 3 Celsius per century, closer to me, the red line here, which is predicted for the next 90 years by the usual suspects at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN's climate panel. And I call this the Ipcc Credibility Gap. And we're going to look very briefly at why this gap exists between what is observed and what they predict. And here you'll see what is settled and not settled about the science. It is settled that if you double the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, then you're going to get about 1.2 Celsius of warming. The equation at the bottom here explains how we get there, and I'll be testing you on that one later, so pay attention, class. Now, then it divides, and along the bottom in red there is what the usual suspects think will happen. They say that once you've triggered the basic warming from CO2, things called temperature feedbacks come into play, and what they do is to triple the rate of warming that CO2 on its own would bring. They have to say that because a rate of warming of just 1 Celsius per doubling of CO2 concentration is not exactly going to be a problem. Whereas we on the skeptical side, in green up there, think that the feedbacks will either be only a very tiny bit amplifying the original warming, or more likely they will be attenuating and reducing it. So that we're going to get perhaps somewhere between half a Celsius and maybe at most 1.3 Celsius of warming per doubling of CO2. And here is the Bode feedback equation. Now, I'm not going to take you through this in detail. All we really need to say is this is the equation that they use so that each temperature feedback that they imagine amplifies itself and all the others in a kind of circuit, feedback circuit. And the real question is, are we talking about a feedback model of the climate at all, or a homeostatic model? And I say it's going to be a homeostatic model because, because over the last 750 million years, now 750 million years ago is quite a long time back. Even Shannon's husband, who's kind enough to be with us today, can't go back that far. The point is that you'll see that there's been ups and downs in temperature, sometimes quite steep, but that the temperature doesn't really move by more than about 8 Celsius, 12 or 13 Fahrenheit, either side of the 750 million year mean. And in absolute terms, that means the temperature's only varied in all that time by about 3%, up or down from the average. And that's a very small amount, given the huge influences on temperature, changes in the strength of the sun, changes in the amount of dust in space between the sun and us, changes in the Earth's orbit. These are big changes that have happened over the billions of years, and yet the temperature has hardly changed. And so when somebody comes along and says, we change the composition of 1/2000th part of the atmosphere, as we may, by the end of this century, assuming that we don't stop emitting CO2, then what will be the effect of this? Well, it's not exactly going to cause the huge changes in temperature which they imagine. The paleoclimate record, as it is called, simply suggests that such extravagant changes for a very small stimulus are unlikely in the extreme, because just like your body maintaining its temperature, the climate does the same. Even if there's an outside stimulus or forcing, as it's called, to try and change the temperature, the climate itself resists that change to quite a large degree. And here is why the feedback model, which is used by the usual suspects, is probably wrong. The red curve here is what's called the climate sensitivity curve, and it's calculated on the basis of different feedback loop gains. I won't explain what those are in this talk, ranging from -1 over here to +1 over at the far end, and 0 is in the middle. So you can have negative feedbacks, and in which case the temperature hardly changes. It's going to range between about 0.5 and 1.3 Celsius if you have negative feedbacks. But if you have positive feedbacks, you'll see that in the range which the Ipcc is talking about, the estimates of temperature change that it's talking about, that would imply that we're just on the point of what is often called, rather unscientifically, a tipping point, where suddenly the temperature will shoot up. Now, the fact is, this has never happened in 750 million years, despite much bigger stimuli forcing the climate than anything we can do to it. And therefore, the only conclusion we can come to is that feedbacks are not as strongly net positive as the Ipcc imagines, and that therefore the amount of warming we're going to get from a doubling of CO2 concentration is unlikely much to exceed 1 Celsius degree, and even that will only be reached in somewhere between 1,000 and 3,000 years' time. And in the literature on feedbacks, there's not very much of it because all of this is mostly beyond most climate scientists, they say that at a loop gain of 1, that's now in the middle of the screen there, the feedback becomes undefined, as indeed it does. But then what happens when it goes over 1 is the feedback becomes defined again, and it becomes as strongly negative suddenly, causing cooling as it had previously caused warming. This too, this very sudden change, has never been observed in the climate. This kind of thing, to this degree, simply hasn't happened. And from this we pretty much know that feedbacks must be small. They must be safely over here, so you get nowhere near that region in the middle of the graph where you could get what's called oscillations in the climate as you pass through the singularity at the middle of the equation. So now you may think this is all rather tough mathematical going. So now we're going to make it a lot easier from here on. We're going to look instead at whether the science being put forward by the official climate panel, whose job it is to tell governments what is going to happen on all this, is straight and honest. And we're going to begin with the fourth of 4 major multi-thousand-page assessment reports on the climate produced by the UN's climate panel. The most recent of these was 5 years ago now, in 2007. And what I'm going to do is look at the principal conclusions of each of these 4 reports to see how reasonable or unreasonable you will find those conclusions after I have told you how they got to them. Let's look then at the conclusion of the 2007 report. Anyone know what this is? Sine wave. An unusually well-educated and alert audience. Congratulations. Give yourselves a round of applause for that. Now, what is the trend of a sine wave? 0. Thank you very much. Yes. Let's show that on the screen, if you would. There you are. A 0 trend. By definition, because sines just go round and round the circle, and so the wave will go up and down and up and down, and the overall trend will cancel out and be 0, as you see there. But if we take just one segment of that sine wave, the segment that you see there on the screen, the trend is actually like that. If we start right from here and go all the way to the end. But now let's move this arrow and start a bit further along. Do that. Do it again. And do it again. Do you see what's happening? The sine wave, we now think, has not just a downtrend, but an ever more rapidly declining downtrend. And yet we know that it really has a zero trend. And supposing we shift the cycle of the sine wave by half a cycle one way, left or right, suddenly we have an ever more rapidly accelerating uptrend. So here we are, we know the trend is zero, but we have used what is now obviously a bogus statistical technique to show, depending on where we choose to start and end our trend lines, either that the sine wave is in fact on a rapidly declining trend, or precisely the opposite, on a rising trend. Same technique, on the same data, different results, which must be wrong. The technique, therefore, is a bogus technique. Would anybody like to argue that the technique is not a bogus technique? Once again, I see no hands. Congratulations. Of course, it is a bogus technique. And you may say, what on earth has this got to do with the climate? Watch and weep. There is the temperature record for the last 160 years from the Hadley Centre, quite correctly displayed in grey and blue there, with the black dots for the individual readings for different years. And you'll see that there is the original trend line going right across the data, correctly calculated, and various other trend lines, all correctly calculated. But the start points of those trend lines have been just as artfully chosen as the ones we chose to distort the zero trend on the sine wave. And as you see, the Ipcc, what it says is that because the more recently starting trend lines are steeper than those that preceded them, therefore the rate of global warming has accelerated, and that we are to blame. And it comes to this principal conclusion not once but twice in its document. Now I want to see hands up anyone who thinks that this could possibly be a justifiable conclusion from this graph. Once again I see no hands, and quite right too. This is a bogus technique. Let's try and see how it was that this came to be. How could any real scientist do anything as obviously bogus as this? And just before I move on and show you that, I want to tell you a little story. I was giving testimony in Congress before the Energy and Commerce Committee a couple of years ago. And the then Republican minority ranking member, just before the Republicans took over control of the House, was Representative John Linder. He took one look at that graph, and without any explanation from me, he said, they can't have done that. I said, that's what they've done. That's what they've concluded. He turned to the Republican group in the room and he said, gentlemen, I think we have seen all we need to see about whether or not any reliance whatsoever can be placed on the findings of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And since then, as you may know, the Republicans in Congress have voted, and rightly voted, to defund the Ipcc altogether. Not a penny more for this bogus science. But what did the scientists submit? Let's have a look, shall we? Now there is a perfectly correct graph with a single trend line covering the entire period. Oh, by the way, the warming rate there is 0.4 Celsius per century. Are you all terrified? No, it's not very much, is it? That's quite correct. And if they'd stuck with that, then I'd have no complaint. But no, they did the slide you've just seen, which is truly an outrage. On we go. And here are the three most rapid periods of warming in the global instrumental record, which began over here in 1850. And you'll see they are parallel lines, which means the rates of warming were exactly the same in all three periods. Now, these periods coincide with the warming phases of a natural climate oscillation called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. It doesn't mean they're caused by them, but it's at least suggestive of the possibility that they're caused by them. But certainly, they're not caused by CO2, because CO2 rises a little bit each year, whereas these temperature changes are going up and down all the time in a sort of cyclical pattern. And because these three lines are parallel at 0.16 Celsius per decade, which is not very much, 1.6 Celsius per century, and that's the maximum warming we have only in these periods of rapid warming, then what we know is that there has been no acceleration whatsoever, whether caused by us or by nature, in the rate of global warming. The entire story is fiction. So now we're going to look at the 2001 Ipcc report. And again, I'm going to show you one of the most extraordinary scandals in the entire history of science. Because in the 1990 report, the first of these 4 reports that they did, the others were in 1995, 2001 and 2007. We've just seen the 2007 report. We're about to look at the 2001 report. You will see the temperatures for about 1,300 years. And there's a large camel's hump there when temperatures were quite a bit warmer than that little pimple to the right, which is today. That was the medieval warm period. And this graph actually appears in the IPCC's 1990 report. And you'll see that then the little ice age, when the Hudson in New York and the Thames in London froze over every winter, and there were pictures painted by the Dutch masters of frost fairs on the Thames in London, there they all were very clearly in the schematic. This is only a schematic, it's not an actual temperature calculation from any data, it's just that was how science understood things to be in 1990 in the IPCC's first report. And broadly speaking, history and many scientific papers confirm that this broad picture is correct, in which case today's temperatures, of course, are not very remarkable. Well, now then, along in 1995 comes a character called Dr. Ken Overpeck, right at the heart of the IPCC's machine. And he wrote to a fellow scientist, who was an honest man, which is how we know the story, saying, we have to abolish the medieval warm period. We have to check whether there was one. We have to abolish it. Because obviously if they didn't, then what's special about today's temperatures? How can we tell it's anything to do with us? And why, even if it was, should we worry about it if that's all we're going to get? So they had to do away with this. Shall we see what they did in the 2001 report? Go for it. All gone. No more medieval warm period, no more little ice age. All those Dutch masters were just making stuff up. It never did freeze over. There never was Viking settlement in Greenland, in places where it's permafrost today. There's a church near Hvalsey, the main settlement in Greenland, where the bodies in the graveyard are in permafrost today. They certainly weren't buried in permafrost, because with medieval tools you couldn't dig through it. So we know it was warmer then than it is today. But the IPCC wanted this to be the case. Now, how did they do this? First of all, they chose the northern hemisphere instead of the whole world. That allowed them to exaggerate the warming of the 21st century, or 20th century, I should say, in red there, by 50%, which makes the graph look a whole lot more exciting than it otherwise was. And of course, the graph has the shape of a hockey stick, long shank with no real change in temperatures for 1,000 years, and then a huge uptick in the 20th century. Any scientist will tell you that a graph looking like that is almost certainly bogus, just because of the sheer extremity of what it's trying to show. Now I'm going to show you just how bogus it actually is. Let's go. The first thing they did was that they tried to reconstruct temperatures from the period before we had thermometers by cutting trees down, old trees, and counting the tree rings back from today, and then seeing which ones were wider than others, because they thought that wider tree rings meant warmer weather. Trouble is, of course, that if you get a lot of rain, you'll get a wider tree ring. If you get more CO2 in the air, you'll get a wider tree ring. It's not a very reliable way of doing it, which is why the UN's climate panel itself had said, don't do it that way. But no, they did. And then they took different trees, several hundred of them, and all the trees that gave them that long shank and then the uptick at the far end, which is what they wanted to do, because they wanted, remember, to abolish the medieval warm period, they gave those 390 times as much weighting in the program that calculated that final graph than they did the one at the bottom here from Maybury Slough in California, actually, which shows no particular trend at all. Nothing surprising happening in the 20th century. So that was the first trick. Watch what else they did. Even if you put random red noise, a particular kind of random data, into the computer program they used to draw the graph, 99 times out of 100, it would draw hockey sticks. No change for 1,200 years, and then a huge uptick in the 20th century. The computer algorithm was bent to give them a graph of the shape that they wanted, so that they could abolish the medieval warm period. Then, this is a really crafty one, they found that if they took out just 20 of the trees that they had used out of the hundreds of trees to compile this graph, along with various other ways of establishing pre-instrumental temperatures, then the trouble was the medieval warm period reappeared. There's the line they published in grey, rather faintly there at the bottom, Mann, Bradley and Hughes, MBH. And here is the line that they got when they took out just 20 of those records, and all the other records combined, even with the dodge in the computer program, even though they chose only the Northern Hemisphere, all the other dodges still in place. The medieval warm period kept on reappearing. And we know that they did this because they archived those 20 in a separate file called censored data. So they knew that their result depended on 20 anomalous records. Did they say that in the papers they wrote up in Nature on the basis of which the IPCC's graph was drawn? No, they did not. Now, it's not for me to say that this is a fraud, a criminal fraud. Hell, yes, it is for me to say that. Next slide. But that's not all they did. It gets worse, believe it or not. Here is one of the ClimateGate emails, the thousands of emails between the few dozen bent scientists who are largely responsible for manufacturing and then magnifying the global warming scare. And here from Professor Jones at East Anglia, one of the creepiest scientists I've ever had the misfortune to meet, is an email to the authors of the original hockey stick graph saying, I've just completed Mike's nature trick. Now, Mike is Michael Mann. He's the guy who invented this bogus hockey stick, of adding in the real temps, etc., a lot of mumbo-jumbo, to hide the decline. Now, I'm going to show you what hide the decline means, because this is the clue to just how far these people are willing to go to make sure that legislators and bureaucrats worldwide are so confused about the science that they spend trillions of your money on completely wasteful projects to make global warming go away when it's not likely to happen in the first place. Here's what they did. Now you'll see here the red, yellow and green datas. Sorry, that should be blue, yellow and red. Blue, green and red, I'll try and get this right. Data are from three different scientists, Keith Briffer, that's Jones from East Anglia, and Michael Mann, who was then at the University of Virginia, now at Penn State. And the actual temperatures for the 20th century are shown in black there, on a highly exaggerated vertical scale to make it look all much more terrifying than it actually is. Now, the important thing to notice here is the green one from Keith Briffer, which was a few trees from the polar Urals, if I remember rightly. And you will see where the arrow is pointing at the right-hand end of the screen there. And you'll see that the data line has plummeted from 1960 to about 1985. And yet the temperature, actually as measured, is going up. And so what we're getting there is that the tree rings were predicting that there'll be a huge decline in temperatures from 1960, but the thermometers were telling us that there wasn't a huge decline, there was something of an increase since 1960. And that was the decline that they wanted to hide. They wanted to hide the fact that tree rings are no good for telling us about past temperatures, because you get these huge inaccuracies. Shall we see how they did it? Okay. Here is a document by the World Meteorological Organization, one of the two parent organizations of the IPCC. And there you will see that far from these three data sets, one of them coming down and two of them going horizontal, which we've just seen, they're all three taken right up to the top where the green arrow is up at the top. Now, the data don't do that, but the graph purporting to show that data, you can see the three things, they're all labeled there, so we know where they got them from. We know it's the same data. They just decided that was the message they wanted to show, and they were going to bend the evidence to fit their conclusion that tree rings were a good way of abolishing the medieval warm period. Let's just show that side by side, the actual data and then what the World Meteorological Organization did to it. And if you take Dr. Briffer's green graph once again, look at the enormous difference indicated by the green arrow there between where the green graph should have ended and where it does end on the World Meteorological Organization's rewrite. And I can see several jaws dropping as far as the floor on this, and so you should be outraged at what is going on here. On we go. Because all of this doesn't establish that there was a medieval warm period. The fact that their graphs showing there wasn't are bogus, and based on a technique that can't tell us there was a medieval warm period or not, because the tree rings are not reliable. That doesn't tell us whether or not there really was a medieval warm period. However, in the scientific literature, my good friend Dr. Idso at co2science.org, which you can look up online, maintains what he calls a medieval warm period database. And he has found just recently that the latest tally is that more than 1,000 scientists from more than 600 institutions in more than 40 countries over the last 25 years have contributed to papers in the scientific peer-reviewed literature, which establish by a bewildering variety of what are called proxies for instrumental temperature, everything from tree rings to boreholes to ice cores, etc., that the medieval warm period was real, was global, and was warmer than the present. Now we're going to look at the 1995 report. This is the second of the 4 reports as we work back through them. And here it's a very straightforward scan, because in that report, as in the first report in 1990, the scientists had very honestly said, when will a man-made effect on climate change be identified? It is not surprising the best answer to this question is we do not know. Now that's honest, isn't it? They're admitting they don't know. And you might say, why am I complaining about that? Well, I'm not complaining about what the scientists submitted. I'm complaining about what the bureaucrats published. That's what came out. The body of evidence now points to a discernible human influence on global climate. 5 times the report as submitted by the scientists had said, no, we can't tell whether there's any human influence, and we don't know when there will be. That was what they'd said. But this is what was printed, because one man rewrote that report at the behest of the bureaucrats, because the bureaucrats were saying to themselves, if we go on producing reports saying there's no human influence on climate, how long are they going to go on paying us to go round to destinations where grass skirts are the norm so that we can have holidays in the name of saving the planet from global warming? On we go. So then we have the 1990 first assessment report, which perhaps encapsulates all these errors in one giant error, which is the pretense that they can tell you how much global warming we are going to get. They're trying to forecast it. Well now, let us see whether they could forecast it. Are there any people in this room who were not on the planet in 1990 and have arrived since then? Hands up. Yes, there are a few. You, sir, must have come from outer space. Don't cheat. But there are indeed some young folk here, and you're very welcome here, and thank you for coming, who weren't even around, because this is a generation ago this forecast was made. Shall we see how the temperatures have actually turned out since the Ipcc first made its forecast of the rapid rise in temperatures that would occur because of global warming from 1990 through that generation until today? Shall we have a look? Here we go. The upper, middle and lower forecasts of the Ipcc are in red, yellow and green there, and in black the actual trend on the University of Alabama at Huntsville's data from the satellites. And as you will see, the actual temperature is below even the lowest of the Ipcc's forecasts. So how do we think the Ipcc is getting on? Is it proving to be skillful with its forecast? Hands up for yes. Not a hand goes up. I don't think I need to take a vote for the no's. On we go. And here, just to put things into perspective, and it's useful to do this, Professor Richard Lindzen gave me this slide. This little gap, which is marked in orange between 2 horizontal, very thin black lines there, that is the entire warming, as measured, of the 20th century, when superimposed on 1 month's fluctuations in temperatures at Boston, Massachusetts. So as you can see, even if there was 0.7 Celsius of warming all around the world over the 20th century, even if we could blame all that on us, which we can't, it's impossible in practice to tell whether it was us or somebody else, it really doesn't make that much difference in the scheme of things. And also they've been over-predicting ocean heat content increase 4.5 times faster than what the Argo bathythermograph boys have been able to measure over the last 6 years. Before that, we simply don't know because not enough data points were taken even to give us the faintest idea. On we go. Oh yes, sea level. Now, you've heard Al Gore's mawkish sci-fi comedy horror movie, and no doubt the kids have been made to watch this several times with glazed expressions on their eyes at school. And he was forecasting a 20-foot sea level rise almost immediately. So what has in fact happened over the last dozen years or so, well, over the last 8 years, since the most delicate and precise of the sea level satellites was put up there and began producing well-calibrated data, sea level has been rising at a rate equivalent to just 1.3 inches per century. Hands up all those who are frightened of that. If anyone has any beachfront property in the Bakersfield area that they would like to sell for $1 because it's going to be worthless thanks to sea level rise, apply here. I am a willing customer. On we go. Yes, and here hurricanes. Oh gee, Al Gore, didn't he have fun when Hurricane Katrina smashed up New Orleans? And why did it smash up New Orleans? It was only a Category 3 when it landed. So it's nothing to do with global warming. And besides, if you look at that green cartouche there for the last year, you'll see that hurricane activity at the moment is at its lowest in the 30-year satellite record. Note the reason why New Orleans went underwater was because the administration there didn't maintain the levees properly to protect them from the sea, which is higher up than the city. And can anyone remind me what kind of political party it was that runs New Orleans and ran it at the time? Al Baby. On we go. The extent and trend of global sea ice. You hear a lot about this, oh, the sea ice is melting. Yes, it is in the Arctic, but not in the Antarctic. It's growing there because there's been 30 years of cooling in the Antarctic. So if anybody tells you there's global warming going on, no, there isn't. The Antarctic, along with Central Africa, has actually been cooling. Combine the sea ice extent of north and south, as this graph from the University of Illinois actually does, and you'll see very little change. Over the 30 years the satellites have been able to watch. And let's just think about this for a moment. If you went and had a cardiograph, and you had a heartbeat as regular as that, then you would be past fit as a very healthy little planet. Methane. Any farmers here? Not tonight. They're too busy trying to plant their crops or something. But if there were, one of the things they might be worried about is what Representative Jim Sensenbrenner in the Congress tends to call a cow fart tax. Now, the cow fart tax, the problem with that is that you don't need one, because the reason why methane concentration was rising quite sharply before is probably the Soviet-engineered methane pipeline running all the way across the vast Soviet plains and into Europe. And when Gaz Putin took over, he realized that the problem was that every cubic foot of gas that was farting out of this pipeline was a cubic foot he couldn't overcharge Europe for. So he decided to send people up and down the line with duct tape and chewing gum to block up all the holes. And by 2000, he'd pretty much finished. And so we've only had about 20 parts per billion increase in methane concentration since the year 2000. And that would be enough to cause, oh, this is really terrifying, you're going to be so scared of this, 1/350th of a Celsius degree of warming. Other things they haven't measured correctly since that first report, here for instance is their predicted human fingerprint. If and only if, says the 2007 report, the warming is our fault, then in the tropics there should be 3 times the warming at altitude, about 5 miles up, than at the surface. That little arrow on the modelled panel there, that's what they predict will happen. But the observations don't show it. So if they're right to say that that is the fingerprint of global warming, then if it isn't there, then any warming that has occurred is nothing to do with us. Likewise, the whole debate is about the fact that outgoing radiation can't get out to space as it did before because of all that greenhouse gas in the way. And that's what causes the warming. Well, here are 11 models around the edge, all of them computer programs to try and predict what happens to the climate. And as temperature increases from left to right, so the amount of radiation escaping to space decreases, causing warming. That's the storyline. But the observations are in the middle. And as the temperature increases, of course, the outgoing radiation increases too. So you do get a little bit of radiation retained down here, but only enough to cause about 0.7 Celsius, say 1 to 1.5 Fahrenheit of warming per doubling of CO2 concentration, much in the range that we were looking at by theoretical reasons earlier. So now we come on to the economic considerations, and here we're going to have some fun because we're going to have a look at your favorite new tax, the carbon tax being introduced in the form of cap and trade by your own legislature. So on we go. We're going to look first of all at the data we start with. And one problem, which I put in a cartouche there, strikes you straight away. In the next 10 years, that's the lifetime of the scheme as proposed by the legislature, it is intended to reduce the state's carbon dioxide emissions by 25%. But those emissions are only 8%. Your state's emissions are only 8% of US emissions, which are only 18.7% of global emissions. So it's uncontroversial that even if this succeeds as fully as they want it to, and you heard it here first, it won't, then you're only going to prevent 0.4%, or as a fraction here, 0.004. 0.4% of global emissions will not happen by 2020 if the scheme fully succeeds. That's not much of a reduction. And we're now going to see just how much global warming that will make to go away even if the scheme succeeds. And here what you'll see is that a carbon dioxide concentration that would, if we'd done nothing about it and kept on business as usual, have been 413 parts per million by volume in the atmosphere by 2020, will fall as a result of California's heroic leadership in closing down its economy faster than anybody else. It will fall from 413 parts per million to 412.9. Big deal. And that, in turn, you simply use the equation I've shown there, which is a very simple and straightforward one, straight from the Ipcc, and that tells you you're going to prevent 1/1000th of a degree of global warming. And how much is it going to cost you? Well, it's going to cost you 182 billion over 10 years just for the cap and trade, about 1.5 times that added onto that for all the other measures. Call it altogether $450 billion. And that $450 billion buys you a remission of 1/1000th of a Fahrenheit degree of global warming. Hands up all those who think that that's a real bargain. And we can then look at what happens if everybody were to follow policies similar to that of California and as cost effective, or as you may think cost ineffective, as those of California, to forestall 1 Celsius degree of warming if measures all around the world to make global warming go away were as cost ineffective as those of California, would cost you an absolute bargain basement, $454 trillion per Fahrenheit degree. And let's break this down. Supposing we just wanted to stop the 1/6 of a Celsius degree of global warming over the next 10 years that the Ipcc predicts by measures similar to those of California. Well, the cost just over the next 10 years up to 2020 would be nearly 180 trillion. That's 25,500 per capita. I'll have your check now, please, sir. He doesn't look too keen on reaching for his checkbook. And perhaps he's from Scotland, like me. And that's also a staggering 33% of global GDP. And these are on the most optimistic and favourable assumptions about how well this scheme will do. 1/3 of global GDP spent over the next 10 years would prevent temperature from rising over the next 10 years. Everything we make and sell and trade and produce for 10 years, 1/3 of that would be needed just to prevent the temperature rising. That is how silly and unaffordable all of this is. And then we look at the ratio of the cost of taking action, which is 1/3 of GDP, to the cost of doing nothing, which at most, even if we don't discount it as we should, is 3% of GDP maximum. And that's from the Stern report of 2006. he takes the most extreme figures ever. He says if the IPCC's forecast is right, then we're going to see somewhere between 0 and 3% of GDP in cost to mankind arising over the next 100 years. So it's 11 times more expensive on this most favourable of presentations for the IPCC, 11 times more expensive to act now on CO2 than to sit back, do nothing, enjoy the sunshine, go surfing, and leave whatever problems there may arise to our grandchildren, who can then adapt in a focused way to any adverse consequences of any warming that may occur, if and when and where, and only to the extent that it may occur. That's the responsible technique. So the economic conclusions are very straightforward, and we'll run through them quite quickly. No policy to abate global warming by taxing, trading, regulating, reducing or replacing greenhouse gas emissions will prove cost-effective solely on grounds of the welfare benefit from climate mitigation. It is all pointless. CO2 mitigation strategies that are inexpensive enough to be affordable will be ineffective. Strategies costly enough to be effective will be unaffordable. Focused adaptation, as and when any problems may arise in future, is the best way. And our descendants will not thank us for spending all their inheritance now on trying to make global warming go away. They would rather us leave the money to them, let them deal with that problem, if it is one, and with any other problem that we may not have foreseen, that they couldn't deal with if we hadn't left them the inheritance to deal with it. So you harm future generations by spending their inheritance wastefully now on policies such as AB 32. In any case, the West is no longer the problem. There are the future increases from China. How do we know? They're building 1 or 2 coal-fired power stations every week, and the annual statistical communicators of the Peking regime make it quite plain that they're going to continue doing that. And look at the little old US down the bottom there in purple. It basically doesn't really figure. So we are no longer the problem, and therefore we are not the solution. Shutting down the economies of the West will not solve the global warming problem, even if we shut our economies down completely, as California's legislature seems hell-bent on doing. So there is a summary of those figures, just in case anyone wants them on one slide. And all of these slides are available, and I can get them to you later if you need copies of them. But there it all is. It's a pretty depressing picture. I just want to point out one figure at the bottom there. The cost of abating the 6 Fahrenheit of warming that the IPCC predicts as its central estimate will occur from man-made effects over the 21st century is a modest $2,700 trillion. And you're looking even less happy, sir, at writing me a cheque for that amount. So the premium then greatly exceeds the cost of the risk, and the answer therefore is not to insure. There's also a moral question, and I want to end on this. First of all, California has a particular problem. Far too many environmental regulations, a cost-ineffective cap-and-trade scam. You've seen just how cost-ineffective now. You've seen why it's cost-ineffective. I want you to get a feel for that. Costly renewable energy mandates that are completely pointless, and a 40-year ban on most offshore drilling, which serves no environmental purpose and merely serves the economic purpose of shooting your own state in the foot. There are also a couple of problems with the University of California not dealing with scandals associated with all this. In particular, there's the scandal of the punishment meted out to Professor Enstrom when he pointed out irregularities in the running of the California Air Resources Board, and the irregularities when Naomi Oreskes accused another scientist quite improperly of misrepresentation of her work when on any view he had done no such thing. And all of the university's regents, written to individually, failed even to reply to her victim. Therefore, my proposal is that the University of California should no longer be recognized as a serious academic institution worldwide. Here's what it's costing you. The Monterey Shale, just up the road, we came across it actually on our way here from Sacramento, holds 15 billion barrels of oil. Production has already fallen by a third since 1990 because of over-regulation. You now have in this state 11% jobless, far higher than that in this county, and 50% jobless in construction. These are the problems which, in my submission, your legislature should be attending to, not global warming, which, even if it were a problem, is not the province of a single state of the Union to try to address. It's blindingly obvious they shouldn't. And look at your Treasury deficit, $6 billion just for this last year. Unfunded pension liabilities to your elderly people, $250 billion. When they turn up for their pensions, they won't find any money there. What happens to them then? Nobody seems to know in that legislature. I've just spent a day there. What is worse, nobody on the administration side seems to care. And I find that unforgivable. All your rich Californians are getting out. One-third of them went in just 2 years, according to the Sacramento Bee, and they've been taking their businesses with them. Twice as many firms fled California in 2011 as in 2010, getting out of the way before yet another impost on businesses by the least business-friendly state in the Union starts to close them down. Intel says it will never again build another plant in California. Globalstar, Trizetto and EI fled in just 1 month last year. Boeing, Toyota, Apple, Facebook, DirecTV, Hilton Hotels, Thomas Brothers Maps, all of these have fled. Your unemployment is second only to that in the state of Nevada. And that's why you shouldn't be faffing around worrying about global warming when you have real problems, real tragedies, real jobs needed now by your working people and your young people coming out of school and university, and your state administration simply kicks them in the teeth. It is unspeakable. And what about the wider world picture? Even before the earthquake in Haiti, the poor there were living on mud pies made with real mud. Made with real mud. Little knob of butter, little pinch of salt just to try to make the mud palatable. Here's a guy, thin as a rail, he lives on these and sells them to his neighbours for 3 US cents each. As a result of the biofuels scam, with which California was much associated, of course, the price of these mud pies, along with all other food around the world, doubled in just 2 or 3 years, a few years ago. There were food riots in a dozen regions of the world. Hands up all those who saw those riots reported in any of your left-wing newspapers or television channels. Not a hand goes up. They don't care how many people their policies kill. Mud pies doubled in price, starvation the result. Here is what the UN's Right to Food rapporteur, Herr Jean Ziegler, had to say about it. When millions are going hungry, it is a crime against humanity, and I'm going to say that again, a crime against humanity, his words, not mine, in 2007, that food should be diverted to biofuels. A crime against humanity. And the same crime against humanity is now being practiced in your state against your people by your administration by AB 32. They are grinding you down into the sort of poverty that once only prevailed in the Soviet Union, where ideologically I sometimes think that some of your legislators seem to belong. And I'm sorry if I'm being too blunt, but it is horrifying what is being done. Look what could be done. Let's end on a more positive note. Here is a lady who had lost her sight very nearly through trichiasis. The trachoma parasite causes the eyelashes to grow inwards, piercing the eyeball and eventually sending the victim blind. That can be prevented for an investment of $8. Just imagine how many people's sight in Africa could be cured with the $450 billion that your state is throwing straight down the plug on making global warming go away. And even if it works, only 1/1000th of a Fahrenheit degree will go away. These are the poor children of Africa. They look at you with their hopeless, hopeful eyes. They need your help and mine now. They need California's help now. They need clean water and safe sewerage now. They need healthcare now. They need food now. They need shelter now. They need fossil-fueled electricity now. And they are desperate. But what are we doing? We're doing AB 32 because we're saving the planet. Ooh, that's killing lots of people, but we're still saving the planet. It's unspeakable. But this is the United States of America. And I have hope from the sheer numbers who have turned out here today, filling this room, taking every chair that we could find, and still there are some people having to stand. I'm sorry about that. That there is an intention at last to fight back against this cruel nonsense. And so I end by saying to you those wonderful words from your own poet, Longfellow, that Winston Churchill addressed to your president in the darkest hour before the dawn of freedom in the Second World War. Sail on, O ship of state. Sail on, O Union, strong and great. Humanity, with all its fears, with all the hopes of future years, is hanging breathless on thy fate. Thank you, and let freedom ring.